We will now hear the presentation of Shaw Communications, Inc. Please introduce yourself and your colleagues, and you have 20 minutes for your presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, Commissioners. My name is Paul Cowling, SVP, General Counsel and Regulatory Affairs, and with me today representing Shaw Communications and Freedom Mobile are Paul McAleese, President of Wireless, Trevor English, EVP, Chief Financial and Corporate Development Officer, Peter Johnson, EVP and Chief Legal and Regulatory Officer, Catherine Emberley, President, Business, Brand and Communications, Brian O'Shaughnessy, SVP, Wireless and 5G Technology, Dean Shake, VP, Regulatory Affairs, Cynthia Wallace, Regulatory Counsel, and Brian Monaco, Regulatory Counsel. Paul McAleese, the leader of Shaw's wireless organization, will kick us off.
Good afternoon, and thank you for spending time with us today. As we begin the proceeding today, we wanted to reflect on the fact that Canada has always honored the men and women who are builders in this country, whether they lace the country with a ribbon of steel that connects our coasts, or they bring Canadians together with communities through webs of glass and invisible radio waves. In that tradition, in 2016, Shaw made a commitment to defy historical odds and boldly build a new force in wireless that will deliver on the promise of disrupting this industry with something new, something better, and something more affordable. As the Commission opens this hearing today, we can say with certainty that this vision is becoming reality. It is absolutely working. Canada's wireless market has never been more competitive than it is today. Prior to Freedom's launch of Big Gig in 2017, no provider in Canada offered 10 gigabytes of data for less than $100, pricing that was holding our country back. How can Canadians take full advantage of the digital economy if they don't have access to affordable data? We addressed this pain point by shaking things up with something completely different, 10 gigabytes for $50 and no overage fees. Big Gig has not only benefited Freedom's customers, which have almost doubled since 2015, it has also benefited millions of the incumbents' customers. Big 3 pricing has decreased substantially over that time, and our Big Gig plans have created an entirely new competitive dynamic. This has cascaded through the markets we serve and beyond. Widely available unlimited plans, more choice across all price ranges, much lower prices, reduced overages, and a better customer experience. Fulfilling our brand promise, we've offered Canadians freedom. Freedom to choose a more affordable, valuable alternative to the uniform, overpriced, and punitive approach of the Big 3. The Big Gig plans would not have been possible if Freedom did not have its own network. After acquiring Wind, Shaw invested billions of dollars to design and build a robust LTE advanced network. Shaw's network independence is the reason for Freedom's success in disrupting the wireless market in Canada. Our ability to leverage the full capacity of Shaw's network allowed Freedom to maximize data and lower prices through a truly differentiated, innovative plan that has forced the Big 3 to respond. MVNO resellers could never replicate this level of innovation and differentiation given their dependence on the Big 3's networks. While succeeding in bridging Canada's data divide, Freedom has never taken its eye off the lower price segment of the market. These customers matter deeply to us. They are the foundation of our business, and we ensure that they have a variety of options with several plans available in the $10 to $15 range. Not only have we moved boldly to offer more affordability, we are rapidly expanding the reach of our network. In the past 18 months, Freedom has launched in 20 new cities, towns, and remote communities across BC, Alberta, and Ontario, enhancing competition and choice for over 1.4 million additional Canadians. Freedom's expansion and increasing strength have resulted in dramatically more affordable services now available across a growing footprint. We want this progress to continue, especially now that Canadians are finally enjoying the benefits of real choice and with the country and the world on the verge of 5G. The fate of that progress hangs in the balance of your deliberations at this critical hearing. In light of our success in beginning to crack the dominance of the Big 3, and in light of what we need to do to finish the job, we cannot overstate our concern with resale MVNO regulation and the threat it poses to sustainable competition, investment, and innovation in Canada's wireless market. We are not opposed to MVNOs naturally evolving, but mandated resale access is not required for this to happen. Canadians won't gain anything from rules that destroy Freedom's ability to continue pressuring the Big Three, nor will they gain anything from a regime that destroys incentives for MVNOs to innovate and target underserved market niches, the most common role that commercial MVNOs play globally. In short, Canadians will gain nothing from resale regulation, but they will lose a great deal.
In 2016, after a long-term capital and strategic planning process, we embarked on a significant asset transformation that launched Shaw into wireless. Starting with the $1.6 billion acquisition of Wind, which we later rebranded to Freedom, we undertook billions of dollars in further investments, all with the goal of providing Canadians with a truly differentiated alternative to the Big Three. The regulatory environment was a critical factor in this decision. Specifically, the long-standing view by regulators that investment is necessary for sustainable wireless competition. Our own aspirations to compete in the long term aligned with the goals of Canadian wireless policy, and we expected support for competitive wireless investments to continue. This wasn't based on a hunch. We had a clear understanding reinforced by many years of decisions and policy pronouncements. Canadian policymakers not only wanted sustained competitive investment, they insisted on it as a condition of entry, made clear and specific spectrum license deployment requirements. New wireless disruptors like Shaw have been spending billions of dollars in contested spectrum auctions to improve our spectrum positions. In addition, Shaw continues to invest almost $400 million per year, upgrading and expanding the network. In order to launch in new communities, we must invest in retail distribution, brand awareness, and a marketing strategy specific to each new market. There are also other substantial costs, such as device subsidies, that are required for us to grow. Since 2016, we have invested approximately $4 billion in wireless, which represents over 25% of our market cap. In 2019, our wireless capital intensity was over 55% of service revenue. And this doesn't include almost $500 million related to the 600 megahertz spectrum purchase. We need to continue investing in order to effectively challenge the Big Three. As we sit here today, we have yet to make a return on wireless. We are growing our subscribers and revenue, but we continue to invest more money than we make. Given the size and nature of the upfront and ongoing investments required, our time horizon for planning and generating returns is long. The regulatory environment must encourage long-term commitments through long-term support, rather than prevent them through regulatory U-turns. The notice for this hearing came out 2 weeks before the start of ISED's 600 megahertz spectrum auction, a critical process for the future of our wireless business. Our valuations and auction strategy had already been approved after many months of preparation. The notice's preliminary view regarding MVNO came as a shock. It called into question many of our assumptions and caused changes to our auction plans, including pulling back on ambitions to expand into new markets. There's another critical spectrum auction coming up for the 35 megahertz band, the workhorse for 5G networks. At Shaw, we hope to play a role in ushering in new technology for Canadians, such as 5G, while continuing to drive affordability and choice through sustained competition against the Big Three. However, all of this requires long-term investments in spectrum and networks, which depend on a reasonable prospect of a return. If the Commission abandons its current path and chooses broad resale, our ability to realize a return goes from being challenging to being impossible. This raises the obvious question of whether we can responsibly continue deploying additional capital into wireless.
As Trevor described, for many years, the policy framework has encouraged facilities-based entry into wireless. This includes auction rules designed to address spectrum concentration, as well as site sharing and wholesale roaming frameworks. Our hard work is starting to pay off for Canadians, but it is not finished. While the Big Three invest in next-generation networks, Shaw will have to concurrently invest at two levels. Like the Big Three, we have to invest in 5G spectrum and infrastructure. However, our foundation is not yet complete. We still need to expand network coverage, including the deployment of our low-frequency spectrum. In order for us to continue with these dual-track investments, we need to build on our momentum and scale. But how can Freedom acquire customers in competition against a reseller with the advantages of a regulated MVNO access? In this environment, resellers will focus exclusively on short-term profits, with none of the burdens and risks that Trevor described. They can enter and exit the market as they please, all while enjoying the extraordinary advantage of regulated access to more robust, more extensive national networks of the Big Three. Resellers will use this advantage to target Shaw's customer base and stifle our growth, thereby risking the consumer benefits Freedom is delivering and without making any commitments to Canadians like Shaw's multi-billion-dollar investments. The economics do not support a broad MVNO resale mandate coexisting with ongoing wireless deployment by a new competitor like Shaw. We did not want to spend so much of this proceeding arguing against mandated MVNO, but given the preliminary view, we had no choice. However, there is an opportunity to refocus this hearing. The Commission has the ability to establish measures that will support sustainable competition, including better rules on seamless roaming and support structure access. It's more important than ever for Canada to facilitate deployment of competitive networks by new disruptors like Shaw. Canada needs strong competition that drives affordability and innovation over the long term. It needs the competitive investment that will provide the foundation for our digital future. It needs to remove barriers for both urban and rural wireless deployment and broadband connectivity.
In this proceeding, the Commission faces the challenge of looking forward and regulating for the future. The stakes are high. In the 5G era, wireless connectivity will be even more important than it is today. Canadians will feel 5G's impact profoundly through new economic, social, and cultural platforms it will support. 5G is not the end, it's the enabler. Through its ubiquity, 5G will change how we do things, strengthen the ties among us, and kickstart an era as transformative as the Industrial Revolution. Canada's international competitiveness and the strength of our economy will depend on the deployment of competitive 5G networks. In the next decade alone, 5G has the potential to create hundreds of thousands of permanent new jobs and increase Canada's GDP by tens of billions of dollars annually. These benefits, if realized, won't be limited to cities. 5G offers the potential for accelerated deployment of broadband to rural and remote areas through next-generation solutions such as 5G fixed wireless. The Commission has the responsibility to lay the groundwork for Canada's success in the transformative shift to 5G. While there are many unknowns in the transition to this digital future, what we do know with certainty is that a dynamic 5G ecosystem depends on a foundation of competitive wireless connectivity. Without the Commission's support, including the definitive rejection of resale MVNO regulation, significant investment in competing 5G wireless facilities will not be possible. We cannot risk returning to the dominance of the Big Three and a static, uncompetitive wireless market in the 5G era. Canadians want and deserve true choice and to be global leaders in the new digital economy. We owe it to Canadians to deliver on the full potential of 5G.
The power of 5G will unleash a dense network of cells affixed to various structures, with hundreds of thousands of sites across Canada. To accomplish this, the Commission must join other global regulators and focus its energy on developing policies to accelerate deployment. Canada requires a new regime for site access, including streamlined access to municipal property, new rules for accessing public right-of-ways, support structures, and multi-dwelling units, and measures to address the legitimate rights of all stakeholders, as well as the significant disadvantages that new disruptors already face in accessing sites. Modernizing the roaming regime is another critical area of reform that will facilitate long-term competition. Mandated seamless handoff is an easy fix that is long overdue, and the consumer harm from its absence is intensifying. As we launch smaller service in smaller communities, such as Comox, Medicine Hat, or Belleville, it becomes much more likely that a customer will leave that community and the Freedom coverage area. This results in more drop calls and data sessions, unnecessarily harming the customer's experience and causing misperceptions about Freedom's network quality. This harm limits Freedom's entry and scale in the new markets and our ability to offer real choice to Canadians. The Commission has an opportunity to fix this now. Not only have the Big Three acknowledged that seamless handoff is technically feasible, it's already actively provided between them. By addressing this discriminatory treatment, the Commission will target one of the biggest barriers to Freedom's growth, while meaningfully supporting customer experience and choice, particularly outside urban centres.
There is overwhelming evidentiary support for our positions on the record of this proceeding, and evidence of robust competition in the wireless market continues to build. The Competition Bureau and its expert, Matrix Economics, provided a detailed account of the state of wireless competition in Canada based on confidential data submitted by nearly 20 operators. Consistent with the evidence presented by Dr. Eric Emsch in his various reports filed by Shaw in this proceeding, the Bureau concluded there is strong competition against the Big Three in those areas where there are strong regional disruptors like Freedom. In the words of the Bureau, it is clear that wireless disruptors, like Freedom, offer the most promising path forward, in sharp contrast to MVNOs, who are necessarily beholden to incumbents' networks. If the Commission mandates a broad resale MVNO regime, it will disproportionately hurt new regional disruptors, putting at risk the positive benefits they have brought to Canadian consumers. While the evidence supporting these conclusions is indisputable, there is virtually no evidence in favor of mandating resale MVNOs. The decisions of this proceeding must be based on facts and evidence, not impressions or unsubstantiated, self-serving, and costly requests to eliminate risks for certain business models. We respect the Commission's need to undertake its process to generate a substantial record, given its statutory obligations as an evidence-based decision-maker. Now that we have this record, Shaw sees no reason why the Commission would seriously consider an MVNO resale mandate or any retail-level intervention to regulate the pricing of wireless services. Instead, as Peter explained, the focus of the hearing should shift to targeted measures that sustain competitive wireless investment through the upcoming transformative era of 5G.
Mandated MVNO resale proponents argue that the new policy direction supports their position. It does not. The 2019 policy direction puts forward diverse considerations: competition, affordability, consumer protection, innovation, rural Canadians, new, regional, or smaller competitors, and all forms of competition and investment. Encouraging all forms of competition and investment does not mean picking resale over regional disruptors, but that is what a mandated resale MVNO regime requires. The existing framework accommodates both commercial MVNOs and ongoing competitive investments. In contrast, as we've explained, with mandated resale MVNO, the economics for wireless competitive investment no longer work. Despite our strong opposition to MVNO regulation, the Commission asked Shaw to put forward an MVNO regime that would be acceptable. In response, Shaw carefully designed parameters that are guided by the public interest, including the objectives of the Telecommunications Act and the two policy directions, offering a model to advance the prospects of sustainable competition for more Canadians, for rural and remote areas, and for 5G. The essential components are that the Commission should focus only on areas where there is currently no facilities-based competition against the Big Three, extending the benefits of choice to the Canadians who currently don't have it, many of whom live outside of large cities and in rural areas. In order to ensure ongoing competitive investment, MVNO regulation should only support temporary access, while a new competitor builds a new network, with automatic phase-out in 5 years. Eligibility must be limited to those who hold spectrum licenses in the relevant area and have a record of wireless investment. In order to move quickly and without interfering unduly in market forces, terms of access should be negotiated, with a strong role for the Commission in setting timelines. Although distinct in details, these parameters align with the Bureau's recommendations. They differ fundamentally, however, from Cogeco's self-serving model, which, like resale, would destroy sustained competitive wireless investment. There is no reasonable basis for you to conclude that MVNO resale complies with the regulatory requirements for mandated wholesale access or offers a better path to advance competition and affordability in Canada. Our submissions have clearly laid out what's at stake in this proceeding, where the public interest lies, and where the evidence unquestionably points. Freedom's success in bringing and forcing others to bring an increasing array of lower-priced, innovative, and consumer-friendly services to Canadians proves our willingness and capability to drive real structural change in Canada's wireless market. We do not understand why you would put these benefits at risk by implementing MVNO resale regulation. The The Commission must restore the regulatory certainty and support that are required to continue delivering affordability, competition, and innovation to the Canadian wireless market over the long term.
As this hearing proceeds, the question before the Commission is very clear. Will Canada continue on its current path to sustainable wireless competition and affordability through the 5G era, or will we abandon that path and experiment with a resale model that risks destroying competitive investment? The correct decision is equally clear. MVNO resale regulation simply does not make sense. It will hurt Freedom, the strongest, most credible champion for wireless affordability in this country, much more than it will disrupt the Big Three. Several years ago, Canadian regulators developed a strategic plan to create sustainable competition that would eventually be strong enough to challenge the Big Three. That strategy is working. In the past 2 years alone, Freedom's presence has achieved more than a resale MVNO regime could ever hope to accomplish. Do not abandon it now. The Commission must use this proceeding to reconnect with the spirit of Canada's building pioneers, their vision, their initiative, and their willingness to take on the risks that propel our country forward. Freedom has been building with a relentless focus on choice and innovation. Canadians want and need us to continue. As policymakers, you owe it to Canadians to please let us continue. Thank you. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your submission. I believe Commissioner McDonald would like to spend some time with you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your comments this morning. In your opening submission, you basically said that you wished you didn't have to spend this hearing arguing against MVNOs. So at least for the first half of my questioning, you're going to get your wish, because although MVNOs have and will continue to take up a lot of oxygen in the room, there's a number of other very important issues at play at this proceeding as well. Just to start off, throughout the proceeding, we've seen a number of different studies that have been presented, a number of different surveys that have been presented, outlining Canadians' views on the state of wireless competition in the wireless market in the country. I believe you recently did one showing that Canadians view regional competitors as having had positive impacts on competition. Other parties have argued that the only reason we're seeing improved pricing now is because of the threat of regulatory intervention. And the province of BC filed a study showing that 86% of Canadians still feel that their wireless prices are too high. So we know from our own tracking that wireless prices are going down. Why does that perception among Canadians still continue to persist, despite the actions of companies such as yourself that have introduced new plans to the market as of late?
Well, there's always a lag between sort of the reality and the perception on things like invoicing. While we've seen significant declines, and the CRTC's own metrics support the fact that we've seen really meaningful declines in pricing over the last 2 years, and of course those studies predated the launch of Unlimited and some of the more recent activity we've seen through the holiday period. So I think the facts are indisputable that we have a significant reduction in the overall cost for Canadian households and their wireless phone bills. But we do have a dynamic that's pushing in the other direction that is not within the control of anyone in this room, which is the cost of devices. We've seen over the last number of years significant inflation in the cost of the smartphones that most Canadians want. And that, when bundled in, is one of those challenges that I think as operators we have a difficult time getting relief on behalf of our customers for. You know, with the launch of the iPhone 8 and X 2 years ago, with the first phone to breach the $1,000 barrier, a year later there was a $2,000 iPhone. You start to bundle that in, as good as the work that we're doing as the regional carriers to reduce the cost of service. The reality is that the total cost of service affected often by the cost of devices bundled in with that, can be distorted. So there is perhaps a lag, Commissioner, in terms of the way people perceive it. Many carriers, of course, bundle the cost of the device and airtime together. So as Canadians continue to pursue and want the best, latest devices, it can often conflate what they are seeing on the cost of service itself.
So when you're looking at the cost to deliver that service, you mentioned devices. Canada is unique in many aspects with respect to the fact that we have a very large geography and a relatively small population. So many interveners have looked to other jurisdictions to try and gauge the competitiveness of the Canadian market against other jurisdictions. And one of those submissions was submitted by TELUS, a study from Dr. Dippon that said, contrary to the views of many Canadians, prices here are actually below international benchmarks. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps comment on that study and whether Freedom would agree with its findings.
Yeah, happy to. Well, I'll let TELUS speak specifically to that study, Commissioner, if I could. But I think it's a dangerous thing to compare a country of 39 million people that is as large as what we have with other jurisdictions. So I often am concerned about studies like that. There are more people in California than there are in Canada. So we have a belief, I think held as an industry, certainly held by Shaw, that the progress we're making on the cost of service is significant and not really comparable to outside jurisdictions.
Okay, if we just limit the question to Canada then, it would appear that some regions are more competitive than others. If we look at the publicly available pricing that can be found for residents of Quebec, their pricing tends to be the lowest in the country, even when you compare it to provinces like Manitoba and Saskatchewan that historically we've thought of as having the lowest prices. So what is the cause of this variation between jurisdictions, even where there may be, the big three are obviously in the market plus a regional competitor?
Well, I think the Competition Bureau did a great job this morning of articulating some of those distinctions. Of course, Quebec market is unique in that the fourth player there, Videotron, has long had a network sharing arrangement with Rogers. So it started with ubiquitous coverage anywhere that Rogers, its largest competitor at the time, had. And of course, they've layered onto that with the addition of facilities-based activity as well. So again, a bit of a unique circumstance in Quebec in that they were able to very quickly build market share, distribution, and confidence as they went to market, which I think supports exactly our perspective on what we believe is our best approach for prospective wholesale here. Quebec will always have a bit of a unique feature because of its history. That really is, I think, the best explanation for why you're seeing the advantage on pricing that you're seeing here. Early scale and sizable benefit.
The profound sort of impact of the Competition Bureau's observation that the variable of the presence of a facilities-based disruptor, I think, is the critical data point here in terms of geographic variability. So where you have that disruptor, you have a better market performance in terms of pricing. Where you have a disruptor that has had time to build scale, like Quebec, then you have even better performance. I think that's the really critical insight that the Bureau study brings to this proceeding and informs the assessment of the problem as well as the assessment of any remedy.
Thank you for that. Freedom obviously operates in multiple provinces. Do you unify your pricing across your network, or do you price based on what region you happen to be entering at the moment?
We have uniform pricing across the markets.
Okay, thank you. In Bell's submission, they included comments from Charles River and Associates which basically said that variations in pricing were due to variations in network quality. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps give your viewpoints on that. Do you think when you're entering a market, you're trying to showcase your service based on price, based on coverage, based on network quality? Are you seeing large variations in network quality between regions that may account for price differences?
We are not.
Okay, thank you. What is your biggest challenge in growing your customer base in the regions that you operate?
Well, there'll be a couple. In the first instance, we're now 10 years into the build of the combined wind and Freedom asset. We're coming on 4 years since Shaw acquired the asset, and really, for the first time, fortified the balance sheet of the wireless entity in such a way that it could go to the market, in a competitive way. For the purpose of the record, it was only 3 years ago that we began our LTE build. It was only 2 years ago that we first brought on the iPhone. So we have had a relatively recent success on a number of things, but compared to the 30-plus year history of our competition, it is still fledgling. In response to your question, we have a significant network perception gap relative to our peers that is simply driven by 30 years of a head start. So while I think the team the work that our engineering and network teams have done to build out our coverage and our quality has been outstanding, particularly in the last few years, the reality is that we can simply not be in all of the places that that our competitors can be. We look to remedy that, and by acquisition of spectrum, both in transactions and through auctions. We have been a participant in that at every opportunity. We acquired nearly $500 million worth of spectrum from Videotron 3 years ago. We participated in the 600 auction for $492 million worth of low band. We are doing everything that we can to, as quickly as possible, remedy those network perception gaps. But the reality is it takes time. So things like the Competition Bureau spoke of earlier on today around seamless handoff, where today, despite a very easy technical fix, we continue to have to force our customers as they leave our coverage area to drop a call and then re-engage that call, is a 30-year-old problem with a $100 fix, and it just isn't getting done. So simple things like that are material in the way that people perceive our network performance. So as we look for opportunities to grow, that will be the single largest thing. It is the product.
You mentioned spectrum, and that's exactly where I want to go next. We've often heard that the cost of spectrum is higher in Canada than it is basically anywhere else in the world. And would that be your view as well?
Gabriel?
Yeah, I would say, even though we certainly agree with the policy around set-aside spectrum, it didn't come for free. When you look at what we paid, which was roughly 80 cents per megahertz per pop for the 600 spectrum, when you look at global averages, that's right on top of the global average, even though we acquired it through a set-aside regime. So we would say, when you look at the spectrum acquisition cost for us in the entire industry, it is fairly high.
And I'm not going to ask for a specific number, because I'm sure that would be competitively sensitive information. But can you quantify for me how significant spectrum costs are in the grand scheme of things, and how that trickles down to the rate that your subscribers end up paying?
Yeah, I'd say it goes into the, when I go back and look at our original business plan, when we acquired Wind back in 2016, we knew we needed to buy additional spectrum. We didn't have any low-band spectrum in our portfolio. We knew we had to go and get that. I would say it is higher than what we expected in our original business plan. It goes into that $4 billion investment, and it goes into what we think we need to charge to earn a reasonable rate of return on those investments over the long term. So it does have it's a significant input into the overall economics of the wireless investments that we're making and the prices that we need to charge to earn a reasonable rate of return.
So given the scarcity of and high price of spectrum, you obviously have to carefully measure how much spectrum you have from a network planning perspective. I've never built a network. Can you outline for me what factors come into play from a spectrum management standpoint and you deciding where to grow and when?
I'm sorry, could I just ask clarification? You say from a spectrum management point of view, I didn't quite follow the question.
From your internal perspective, when you're making decisions to bid on spectrum and how you in turn manage that resource if you're successful in the auction to launch services for your customers.
Okay. Yeah, there's multiple things we must do when building a network in terms of managing technology and spectrum, et cetera. So first is building sites to the extent that we need and to get full coverage. And then we start adding new technologies on top of that to get more capacity and be able to manage all the customers we have. Spectrum is a key tool in that there's really two types of spectrum we go after. One is low frequency, low band spectrum, because it covers very large ranges. Think of it like an AM radio covers farther from a tower than an FM radio does. It's the same kind of concept. So it lets us build broadly and widely throughout. So when we bought spectrum from Videotron recently, a couple of years back, we went and the main piece was buying that 700 megahertz low band spectrum to allow us to get better range of coverage and service into houses, into buildings where people want to use it. We also recently, during the auction, bought 600 megahertz spectrum, and there were two reasons for doing that. One, it was more low band, so you can get higher speeds at longer ranges and deeper into buildings. And the second is that'll be the first piece of spectrum where 5G technology will be deployed. So both of those went into a business case to decide how do we want to buy that spectrum. Then you have a whole pile, and the main spectrum that everyone's using is mid-band, which gives you really heavy concentrations of traffic in cities, lets you carry the large amount of traffic that our customers want to use. So those are the pieces that we put together when using spectrum and making a decision.
In paragraph 34 of your submission from May the 15th, you stated that the big three are incented and able to foreclose new competitors from gaining access to the spectrum they need to compete. Can you expand on that a little bit for me? Do you mean that the national providers are intentionally hoarding or not using spectrum?
It's not so much a question of hoarding, it's a question of the value of keeping competition out. It's more valuable to pay more for the spectrum regardless of the inherent value that they've done through a commercial valuation, to pay a little extra, the foreclosure value, to prevent an entrant or a new entrant from acquiring the spectrum. We've made this point in many spectrum policy proceedings. It is the critical reason why a set-aside is a necessary measure to ensure that parties other than the big three, who currently have a very high market share, who currently enjoy a very high share of revenue, they dominate the market. They're incented to continue to dominate the market, and one of the ways they can do that is by maintaining their current concentration of spectrum holdings. So with each band, you take a look at what the spectrum concentration is, and are they incented to keep the new competitor out? On 600, the answer would definitely be yes, because if we didn't have that low frequency spectrum, we wouldn't be able to continue competing in the market. So that's why spectrum policy is critical to our entry, our presence here, and our ongoing success. It's ICE's jurisdiction, but it's an extremely important part of the whole equation in terms of our ongoing success.
Okay, so thank you. I'll try and ask that maybe just a slightly different way then. If this belief or this observation comes from the prices that national providers are paying for their spectrum, and it's just to keep you and other regional providers out of the market. I would assume that an indicator that that is actually happening could be large amounts of unused spectrum that's owned by the big three. Would I be correct in that?
Not necessarily. It's not necessarily the case that they wouldn't. They may or may not be using the spectrum. They likely would use the spectrum that they would pay. The point is that they'll be paying beyond the commercial value that they've done through their own valuation. It isn't necessary to prove that they have unused capacity in order to prove the foreclosure risk. There's widely available economic studies that prove the foreclosure risk in a circumstance like this.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Have you tried to negotiate access to the spectrum of the big three in the past?
We have not negotiated or attempted to negotiate with any of the big three with respect to access to spectrum per se. There have been previous discussions regarding other opportunities, but not with respect to accessing spectrum. And this would have been some time ago.
Okay, thank you. I know you said it would be some time ago, so the information might be a little bit dated and it didn't have to do directly with spectrum. But what did that negotiation process go like? Were you successfully able to negotiate well, negotiate commercially acceptable terms with the big three for the services that you were looking to gain from them, or were you met with significant roadblocks?
Nothing materialized from those discussions, and I would describe them as exploratory.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears to seamless roaming. I guess I've asked the exact same question I just did again, but in the context of seamless roaming. I guess could you quantify, to start off, could you quantify the problem for me? I understand, obviously, someone drops their call when they're moving from one network to another. Can you quantify that problem for me?
Yeah, let me explain the user experience. It's a real issue that our customers face every day, and it accentuates as we get smaller and smaller networks. And the reason being, and let me give you an example. If we were to leave from here right now, get in a car and get on the phone and drive towards Brockville, you'd go through Ottawa down the 416. Everything would work fine on the network. You'd be on the call continuously. As soon as you get past 5-10 minutes past Barhaven, the signal will drop because our network ends at that point. So the call would disconnect. Then for about the next 10 minutes, the signal, the phones can still see that there's a network there, but it's not strong enough to use. So you can spend the next 10 minutes not even be able to make or receive a call. Because your phone can see the tower, but in a weak signal, not good enough to complete a call. And after that 10 minutes, then you can launch onto the roaming network. So we have around every market that exists where we've built service, we have these gray zone boundaries all the way around where you cannot make or receive calls. If we had proper inter-system handoff, roaming handoff, basically you'd get to the edge of the service, the signal would start to drop, the call would hand off automatically to the other network and continue on, and the customer wouldn't even know the difference. So the real issue is, especially as you start looking at what we've done in smaller markets, whether it's the interior BC or up and down the St. Lawrence Seaway, you have all these little towns where you're very quickly leaving the service area around the edges. And for a lot of people, some that's acceptable because they're staying in the core. A lot of people it's not because they're in and out of town a lot and they've got these zones where they can't use their phone. So this is what seamless handoff will do for us. It'll allow the customer to continue to receive service throughout that area.
Thanks. I understand what it would do for you. I'm trying to sort of quantify how large the problem is, and it may be a question that you prefer to answer by way of an undertaking. I'm trying to quantify how many drop calls are we talking about? How many customers have you lost because they view your service as subpar because seamless roaming isn't currently available?
The number one issue in our churn studies, the reason that people leave the Freedom Network is related to network. And the number one network reason is related to exactly this problem, which is the handoff between where we have quality coverage and where we don't have quality coverage. It would be, over the course of a year, millions of dropped calls, if not more than that. And in terms of quantifying it, I would probably condition this at something like 25% of our churn is related directly to this issue. Not 100, but not zero. It's certainly a sizable percentage. And think, if you will, for a minute, there are some customers that never experience it. So this is where the averages can be dangerous. If you are living and working downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver, this is an issue that you seldomly actually experience. If you live at the fringe, as Brian has discussed, you can have this occur as you ping back and forth into coverage many times in the course of a day. So if you imagine yourself in that situation, Commissioner, it's a very difficult thing to want to stay with a carrier that could be remedied very, very easily, but for reasons that are really unclear, it hasn't been remedied.
And I assume that has a trickle-down effect into all areas of your operation. Presumably, you wouldn't want to sign up a new customer that you know was going to face those challenges on a day-to-day basis.
You're absolutely correct. It trickles into how easy it is for us to secure distribution in those markets. It trickles into how easy it is for families to add additional lines, which is a common source of volume for carriers. And maybe more important than those things, it has a significant impact on our brand. So it continues to unfortunately make a dent in the way that people perceive Freedom's quality. Even though it may be at the margins for many customers, those are customers that tend to be more vocal in their concerns. So it makes its way into social and everything else. And while it may only be a fringe user in Brockville, that user may not be evident that they're in Brockville when they're on Twitter or on Facebook or one of the social sites talking about their network issues. So it can be perceived as a network-wide issue across our national footprint.
And would it also be a safe assumption that that means, from a network perspective, you need to spend a significant amount of your time and resources going back and filling in holes in the network versus launching new services to new municipalities or new regions of a given province?
Yes, absolutely. We spend a lot of time every year figuring out where these problems are occurring and trying to secure additional real estate and sites to help solve problems.
Have you, and this gets back to my earlier question, obviously the national providers can and are doing seamless roaming between them today, so it is technically possible. Have you approached Bell or others about entering into a seamless roaming agreement?
Yes.
Since you don't have seamless roaming, to my knowledge, with them, I can guess what the outcome of that process was. But can you expand on that in any way? Was it a total non-starter, or did it just get down to, commercial rates, as an example?
It's been a total non-starter. The commercial rates have been set through the mandated roaming. So rates aren't even on the table, so you can surmise what the issue was. This is a fantastic way to continue to subordinate Freedom's class of service at no cost to the big three.
Still on the same topic, in your second intervention of November the 22nd, paragraph 91, you state that as the big three acknowledge seamless roaming is technically feasible, as we've said, and the work required to implement and maintain seamless roaming is reasonable and not unduly costly. You also agree with Quebecor that the cost and technical burden of implementing seamless roaming rests more with the requesting operator. So can you give me an idea of what is required from a technical standpoint and what the costs would be from the requesting operator's standpoint?
Right. So the actual implementation requires additional signaling links between the two operators, so it's fairly straightforward. We already interconnect with everyone today, so it's just an additional link to do so, and turning on protocols that already exists in our networks. So it does not require the implementation of new equipment. It could be there's some traffic that requires just more capacity on a link, but there's no new systems required to make this happen. I don't have off the top of my head a price in mind, but it's definitely not millions of dollars. It's an arrangement to connect, an interconnect arrangement between us and labor to turn on the capability. And
is that a one-time charge or a one-time cost, or is it ongoing month after month?
There's two parts to it. There's an one-time just to set up the architecture and make it work properly. There's monthly, obviously, if you have additional links between us, there's a cost of managing those links, relatively small in the grand scheme of what we're already managing. And then there's just coordination efforts as we go on over time to make sure as the boundary changes, you have to at least change which sites are handing off to which other ones. If as we roll out a larger network, there's some reconfiguration work required. It all fits in the category of labor and activities, and it's stuff we do today. With our roaming mandate, as we add new sites, we need to go in and change the databases on both our networks as to which one of their sites is going to take our service now that we have a larger border. If we've moved it out a bit, we have to stop roaming on the sites where we've now covered. That's just something we do month to month today anyway, so it's an ongoing extension of that activity.
And presumably that activity would have to be shared between yourselves and whoever your roaming partner.
That's correct.
Is.
There's work on both sides to make that happen.
Okay. And how frequently does that work have to happen? Is it something that requires constant maintenance, constant staff dedicated to it, or is it a matter of keystrokes once a month?
It's normally we exchange information once a month or every other month, depending on the area, and both sides must do some work. But it is not a massive piece of work. You don't need a department to do this. This is part of someone's job who already exists.
If we were to mandate seamless roaming, would changes need to occur with the roaming tariffs that are currently in place?
You'd need to clarify that seamless roaming is a part of the service. It doesn't change. This is an implementation of this existing service. But apart from that, that's it.
Okay. What are your thoughts on a phase-out to seamless roaming? Knowing that it is a problem in your fringe areas, presumably if that problem can be temporarily resolved, that would give you time to further expand your network. Is this something that's could potentially have a sunset or would need to continue indefinitely?
Again, we see this as an adjunct to the existing mandated roaming service, which is necessary because it is impossible to replicate the national scale of the big three. So as long as mandated roaming is appropriate, mandated seamless roaming should also be appropriate. Again, it's not a different service or a new service that's being mandated. We're talking about the effective implementation of an existing service. We are not, the Canadians who deserve the benefits of the competition that seamless roaming facilitates aren't getting that benefit. We need to fix the implementation of the current regime. So the phase out of the seamless roaming you wouldn't ask about that until you're asking about the phase out of mandated roaming generally.
Okay. Still on the same topic, paragraph 85, you state that in your view the Commission must clarify, as you just said, that mandated wholesale roaming supports the implementation of new wireless technologies and standards such as VoLTE and 5G. Just to be clear, in your view, does the current definitions in the roaming tariffs of the national wireless carriers apply to 5G services?
Yes.
Okay. And you feel that would have no impact on the rates currently in place or any other changes that would be required?
No.
Very succinct, thank you. In the context of MVNOs, different parties have made, the argument that, 5G should be excluded for the purposes of this conversation right now because it's still very early days and it would be premature. Just so I'm clear, you don't think that same 5G should not apply thought should also apply to seamless roaming?
Let me rephrase. We believe that seamless roaming should extend and expand to 5G as well.
Okay. Moving over to network sharing, some parties in the proceeding have stated that one of the downsides of network sharing is that such arrangements exclude new entrants because national players are unwilling to enter into spectrum or network sharing arrangements with regional providers. Just to jump back to the earlier comment, you have not tried to negotiate any network sharing agreements with the national providers or other regional providers for that matter?
No, we have not, but I would say that we're on the record to say we see the benefits for both sets of stakeholders around a possible network sharing arrangement, but we've also heard from other parties that say they're on the record as well that they think that there's a strategic advantage that they own and control their network 100%, so we haven't been able to enter into any in-depth commercial arrangements or discussions around a possible network share.
But you would not be supportive of the view that network sharing agreements should be limited or prohibited in any way. Would that be an accurate statement?
That's true.
Okay. Some other countries, notably South Korea and Germany, have been looking at joint builds for 5G networks. And I wonder if I could get your thoughts on a similar approach in Canada.
I think this introduces the whole issue of invigorating the access regime. I'll ask Peter to speak about that, but this is, it really does tie into what we've been saying on the record about an increased focus on access.
Yeah, so if we turn to access, we found it interesting in the FCM submissions that they supported and identified a concept of coordinated access for support structure. And we have had some experience with, in the City of Toronto, for example, at the Union Station, where the city required the big three to basically negotiate access to the Union Station, and they also required that Shaw participate. So what's critical here is that the competitors are given access on these joint sharing arrangements. They shouldn't be strictly available just to the big three, but to the competitors as well, so the disruptors like Shaw. On access generally, we've made a number of submissions and we've promoted the concept of the Commission, frankly, taking some leadership in terms of the deployment of 5G networks. And we believe that there is international precedent for the leadership by a regulatory authority such as the CRTC to really facilitate the seamless deployment of networks and the efficient deployment of networks. And in our submissions, we identified, for example, the use and the creation of a public infrastructure working group. We believe that the working group concept would really bring together stakeholders from across both regulators, industry, manufacturers, and other stakeholders to really coordinate the access to public infrastructure. We believe that this would be in the interests of the municipalities. They don't want to increase the burden on themselves in terms of the administrative oversight of access. And we also think it would really facilitate the deployment from the industry's perspective and really coordinating that approach. I'm happy to elaborate further, but I don't want to transgress too far here.
No, that's helpful. And I mean, I would assume with coordination and a joint build, there would be efficiencies that could be found, there would be cost savings that could be realized, and more people could avail of the benefits of 5G sooner versus a scenario whereby each provider built out their own 5G network from scratch.
Yeah, we definitely see the efficiencies with this coordinated approach, especially on a national level, setting standards that could be used across the country by various municipalities, and also it would give some certainty to the actual industry players who are building up the networks.
And I promised I wouldn't get into MVNOs for the first half, but just one question. One of the strongest arguments against mandating MVNO access is that it could have a negative impact on the rollout of services to underserved areas, but also on the deployment of 5G. If we assume that there would be negative financial impacts and a negative impact on the rollout of 5G, could those scales perhaps be rebalanced if there was a joint 5G build in Canada?
Sorry, are you suggesting if we're talking about a coordinated approach, we're talking an approach for network builders? I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. Are you suggesting otherwise with an MVNO range?
I guess to phrase it another way, could the benefits of that, could the financial benefits of that coordinated joint approach be significant enough to offset what many argue is the negative impact of mandated MVNO access on network deployment?
I'll let Paul speak to the mandated MVNO resale, but the efficiencies that we're realizing or would realize by way of a coordinated approach on deployment would be minuscule compared to the prejudice to network builders, particularly ourselves, of an MVNO, mandated MVNO arrangement.
Commissioner, it's a difficult question to answer because I think that the devil would obviously be in the details. I mean, we're certainly saying and on record that if there was a broad resale MVNO environment, it would make us think twice and pause, what future investments we'd be prepared to make for future technologies such as 5G. If you're able to stitch together a joint build or network share, would that offset it? It's very difficult to answer your question specifically.
Okay, that's definitely fair enough. In your submissions, you reported that you've experienced delays in gaining access to ILEC support structure, and you made recommendations to help address these concerns. Can you help quantify that for me, expand upon it a little bit? What are the length of delays? How frequently do they come up? What is the impact to your end customers?
I'll jump in here, and then others can, Brian, if he wants to provide specific examples, can. What we've seen with the ILECs in particular is the delays in terms of their establishing certain ground rules which we feel are prejudicial to us. So it's not that we don't ultimately get access to the facility, it's the time period for which, in which we have the delay. So we can't attach to a pole, for example, or use the conduit for some period of time. That's why we proposed what we consider to be reasonable periods of time for reserving any space by the ILEC. We said 1 month for small cells and up to 3 months for wireline attachments. Our experience is largely informed by our wireline attachments, but as we've seen it with Wi-Fi facilities, so access points. Think of an access point attached to a strand in between two poles, or other facilities, wireline facilities. And our view is that the Commission can really take some leadership here in terms of its jurisdiction over the ILECs to really facilitate our deployment on an efficient basis and really remove the barriers that competitors like the new entrants face. But I would also say that I believe Rogers has also made some submissions regarding their challenges in terms of access to ILEC infrastructure as well. So there is, it'd be difficult to quantify it, but there certainly has been delays in terms of periods of time, in terms of when we've been able to access the infrastructure. And I know that some of the submissions by the ILECs have suggested that they need a 2 to 3 year window really reserve the space on their support structure. You can imagine how challenging that is for us to deploy our networks if there's a 2 to 3 year window in terms of reservation of space.
I think you started to go down the road of answering this question, but are the delays created just by the sheer volume of requests that may be going to an ILEC at a given period of time? For example, if you're undertaking a significant network build, or are there specific rules in place or requests for information coming from the ILECs that are causing the delays?
Delays take a number of forms. There can be, as we mentioned, the reservation of space. There can be construction standards. And there can also be Safety Code 6 or safety standards that are imposed on us but not on others. And so those are all problematic from our perspective and really, frankly, need to be addressed for us to remove one of these barriers to competition and will really kind of enhance our deployment for a competitive network.
You said imposed on you, not on others. Can you?
Well, we would suggest that it's, in our experience from both the wireline and otherwise, we've seen some challenges on these rules are really applied to our experience. We can't speak for others, although the record is full of references by Videotron, Rogers, and others in terms of the challenges they've had with respect to access to ILEC infrastructure.
The answer to this question is probably it depends. But how much time, how much delay is reasonable? What is a reasonable turnaround time for you to be able to gain access to a given support structure? And maybe that timeline differs depending on whether you're trying to attach a 5G piece of equipment or fiber to a pole or different types of support structure.
Yeah, in our submissions, we've suggested a time frame which we think is reasonable. But certainly less than a 6-month window would be critical for us. And we are concerned about the amount of space that's reserved. We're concerned about the time periods and the delays that are imposed. And again, it's a challenge for us to do our own planning and you can imagine with small cells, there's going to be more than, because of the number of them, it will really kind of move. We will want to move quickly to make the attachments and basically make a number of attachments over several blocks. So we need to have some more certainty in terms of our planning.
I guess at a high level, what indicators should be looked at to determine, to distinguish between what's a reasonable amount of time or a reasonable delay and what might potentially be an anti-competitive behavior on the part of the ILECs?
One of the reasons why we like to establish this working group is because we believe that some of the details of this can be worked out and resolved through the working group. Both, we mentioned it with respect to public infrastructure, but we could also see it with respect to ILEC infrastructure. And so we believe if you bring the stakeholders together, and maybe we need to look at make-ready costs, for example, make-ready work costs, and the sharing of the actual pole itself. Maybe we need to look at first-come, first-served models if we can't get to a point where we can live with the reservations of space and kind of what is considered to be a reasonable time period for that. So there are different solutions that can come forward here, and we think that the working group can, frankly, facilitate this and make this a process that will be efficient for all.
Thank you for that. You also proposed that ILECs should document and track their spare capacity. I understand what the benefits would be for a provider such as yourself looking to gain access. Can you weigh those benefits against the additional regulatory burden that would be imposed on the ILECs?
Yeah, we've thought about this, and the first-come, first-served model might work in a more, to address some of the regulatory burden. So what do we mean by that? I think the consequence of that would basically be that The ILEC would probably have to share some of the make-ready costs, make-ready work costs with the licensees. And we think that there is an opportunity here for us to revisit that regime. So if there is a concern about the regulatory burden in terms of maintaining the records for the reservation, then there is an opportunity here to look at a revised regime with a first come, first serve, and then address the make-ready work costs as well.
And should the Commission do anything with that information proactively?
Well, we think that the Commission can certainly be engaged in the process, and that's why we like the working group concept, because we could see the working group reporting back to the Commission and moving forward with some recommendations that could be adopted and then adjustments to tariffs.
With respect to your working group or the committee that you've been talking about, what specific actions would you see them taking? What specific mandate should they be given beyond what is already accomplished when you or other providers are negotiating with the ILECs today?
What we would like to do and look at the opportunity globally in terms of what other regulators have done in terms of facilitating access and moving forward with the deployment of 5G. And they've looked at a number of things, and we've identified them in some of our RFI responses from the summer. We think that there's definitely a room to define what is considered a small cell wireless attachment. We think that you can look at a dispute resolution mechanism in terms of moving forward with any disputes that arise, whether it's with a municipality or whether it's with an ILEC. We certainly think that there is a model to be looked at with the FCC September 2018 order, where they looked at basically the costs and fees that could be established for attachments, and particularly in the small cell piece, looking at whether or not a permit should even be required in the first instance. So, and municipalities might have concern about congestion or aesthetics, and again, we think the working group really facilitates and expedites that process. Ultimately, we think that that's in everyone's interest. It's certainly in the municipality's interest in reducing the regulatory burden, and it's also in the interests of Canadians and consumers, and it's in the interests of the industry as well.
Perhaps you could comment on the effectiveness of a potential working group. I mean, one of the challenges that is often cited, you get 20 different stakeholders in a room together, it can become difficult to find consensus on anything. Why do you feel that these different groups, multiple municipalities, multiple service providers, would be able to be of one unified voice on many of these issues?
We've actually, been interested in some of the responses in the submissions by the municipalities that were supportive of some of the initiatives and the ideas that we came forward with in terms of our submissions. So we actually think there's more commonality of interest than meets the eye. Certainly we can see, and we've discussed some of the challenges with the ILECs, but we do feel that there is a common ground here, and that we all want to see the deployment of 5G because it will benefit all of us in terms of what we know to date in terms of the advantages of 5G networks. So there is some incentive for all of us to get this right and to move it forward quickly.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears for a moment, I want to talk about affordability, specifically low-cost and occasional use plans. And just to start off, to my knowledge, Freedom doesn't include any overage charges in your price structure. And I'm just wondering if you can expand upon why you made that particular business decision. Your competitors are driving significant revenues from overage.
I've heard that. We made a decision early on in the brand promise for Freedom that we wanted to avoid what we classified as toxic revenue. And we felt that punitive overage charges, particularly at some of the rates onerous rates that are being charged in the Canadian market, which, as I think you'll know, are upwards of $100 a gigabyte, felt like the kind of revenue that we could do without and the kind of customer interaction that we could do without. So we chose some years ago to simply throttle the speed of a customer's overage, but not ever penalize them financially for their use.
Okay. I'll draw your attention to exhibit number 2, which was filed by us this morning, outlining a subset of occasional use plans that are currently in the market from various different providers. There are, I believe, 2 on the list from Freedom, one at about $15, one at $14 a month, and then one at $15. In your opening comments, you had said that you also offered plans sort of in the $10 to $15 range. Are there other plans other than these 2 that should be included in this list?
Well, plans cycle in and out based on competitive dynamics. Excuse me. There's also credits available for customers that bring their own devices, which net our $15 MRC rate plans down to a lower figure. So my reference to 10 to 15 was in specific regard to that.
Okay. But even though they may cycle in and out, you may have some grandfathered customers on them, you would always be maintaining at least one plan sort of in that $10 to $15
Correct.
zone.
Yeah.
Okay. And is one plan typically what you would offer, or do you, like knowing that each household is different, do you offer various different plans for different subsets of the market in that range?
We try and have, we try and have plans that have the availability of no data for customers that are perhaps using Wi-Fi or using it simply for more kind of emergency type of situations for perhaps an elderly parent or something, just simply for point of contact. And then also small amounts of data for customers who might use their phone for occasional emergency mapping or something like that. But we've always tried to have a small blend of plans to hit different customer needs.
And excuse me, what is the lifespan of a plan before it's renewed? Presumably, because you change them, you go back and look at them periodically to make sure they're meeting the needs of your clients.
We do, and fortunately, over the last number of years, typically those examinations have resulted in plans typically being enhanced. So as the market has changed, again, in the interest of more affordability for Canadians, we typically move to a situation where customers get additional value in those plans. But typically, they're at least a year. The big gig plans that were referenced earlier on that were launched in October of 2017 remain largely unchanged today. And I've been on record in the past saying that we prefer not to change our rate plans with great frequency. It's an expensive and frankly somewhat complicated thing to train our distribution. We've got hundreds of points of sale and thousands of people that sell for us. So you want to try and keep the operating cost of the model down. So once committed to a series of rate plans, we try and keep them in the market for quite some time.
And do you grandfather those plans if you still have customers on them that haven't migrated to another?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So if I were in the market for a low-cost plan from you...
Are you? Because I can help you there.
Well, talk to me after the hearing.
Okay.
How would I go about doing that? How are they advertised? Are all plans available and easily accessible on your website, or are they hidden multiple clicks away?
No, they're all available on the website and very easy to find. They're also merchandised in our stores and widely and easily found.
And do you use any of those low-cost, sorry, I shouldn't say use because that might have a negative connotation, but do you target any specific customer segments with those low-cost or occasional use plans? I'm thinking low-income individuals, seniors.
Well, we don't target them in our mass media typically, partly because, frankly speaking, Commissioner, they're a little niche. One of the things that's been most interesting to me since the launch of the big gig plans back in 2017 has been that customers are typically looking for higher value and higher use plans. So despite the availability of these, these plans represent a relatively small percentage of what we sell. So demand actually is relatively low here.
Without getting into what that percentage is, does it change greatly year over year?
It does not.
Okay. And do you ever follow up with these customers to ensure that plans are continuing to meet their needs?
Yeah, once a customer has been activated on our system, they go into our base management group who follow them through the course of what we call journeys. So we know, for example, how old their phone is. So when we know that that phone might be reaching the end of its kind of productive life, or that customer may be interested in an upgrade on that phone, we try and follow them along and have regular contact with them. So if and of course, every time the customer reaches one of our contact centers, it's a point of discipline for us to ask if there's anything else we can do to, if the customer's plan still suits their needs. While we have them there on the phone or in our stores, we take the opportunity to have that conversation with them. So we try and keep it as current as we can on the customer's behalf.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned just a few minutes ago the number of points of contact that customers can use to purchase a device from you or purchase a plan from you. Are your customer service reps fully trained on all low-cost and occasional use plans that you would have in the market?
They're trained on the entire portfolio of plans without any particular focus on one versus the other. So we're as interested in a customer who's on a $15 plan as is on an $80 plan. Customers find their way to us on these things and often come in with a friend or a relative knowing what they're looking for. But we have a kind of broad range of training across all plans and all devices.
Would it be possible for you to file a copy of your training material that you use specifically in the context of low-cost plans?
I could be happy to do that.
Okay, perfect. The deadline for undertakings is March the 10th at 8 p.m. Ottawa time.
Thank you.
With respect to low-cost plans, are customers subject to a credit check if they want to purchase a low-cost plan?
It depends whether they're acquiring and financing a phone at the same time. So if a customer comes in, for example, a lot of these plans typically are on prepay. So a customer will simply provide a month's worth of service fee in advance, and at that point they're not subject to any credit review.
Okay.
Likewise, if a customer is coming in on prepay with their own device, they're not subject to a credit review there either.
Okay. Several parties that have intervened have suggested that the Commission should mandate a low-cost plan that would be available to a means-tested segment of the population, such as low or fixed-income households. And I'd like to get into those specific plans for just a moment. But at a high level, from your standpoint, what would be the potential challenges in terms of implementing and administering a mandated low-cost plan? What would it look like?
Well, if we follow the U.S. example and the use of the universal service fee to support the Lifeline program in the U.S., the most significant complexity in administering that comes from the people who administer the data. So the customer's eligibility would have to be curated in a central point and provided on a safe harbor basis to the eligible carriers. In other words, I don't want to be the one determining whether a customer's bona fides are true, right? If someone is, whatever the threshold is, that's going to have to come from a bigger pay grade than me.
I would be shocked if you said you wanted to do the means testing. Given that complexity, would it not be simpler just to mandate a plan that is provided at low cost but available to anyone who may choose to avail of that service? Skinny wireless?
Well, branding notwithstanding, I would question, if I could, the premise of that. I've described these low entry cost plans as a a solution to a problem that is not apparent to me. We have very little demand for these plans despite their availability now for something like 18 months. And I suspect the other carriers that you see in here will tell you as well that despite them being widely available and very good value, it simply doesn't provide customers with what they're looking for. So the vast majority of people in this country are now using a smartphone and seeking data. And I'll spare the blushes of the room, but I imagine there aren't too many people in this room that are looking for a $10 plan. And so I have read and understand the position put forth by those third parties. But as you can see from this list, which is 2 pages long and doesn't have a rate plan over $15 on it, there are 20 options here. I'm not sure what a mandated plan would do that this piece of paper doesn't suggest is already in place.
Okay, I take that point, and before we get back to what a plan could look like, just a couple of final questions. ISID's Connecting Families Initiatives works with ISPs to connect low-income families with internet for $10 plus tax a month. And it's available to those receiving the maximum amount of the child benefit. Could such an approach be taken on the wireless side as well?
It absolutely could.
Other than the, well, let me go back. Would there be any challenges from your standpoint in honoring such a commitment?
Not in honoring such a commitment. I think the complexity, again, goes to making sure that the information that we have is current and well curated so that we're abiding by the rules of eligibility. We would potentially run into issues with customers who want that plan and then are looking to additionally finance a phone. So I'm assuming that your credit check question had something of a back note to it, which is, are we ever putting customers in a position where they may not be able to get access to our network because of credit deficiencies? And in my experience here, we will have a number of people who are looking to put a $1,000 phone on a $10 plan.
Okay.
And that may pose a challenge to their eligibility to finance that phone with us.
Okay. Other than the plans that we've discussed in the $10 to $15 range, do you have any other programs that might be specifically targeted at lower income Canadians, discounts on refurbished phones, for example?
We do not.
Okay. Exhibit 3, this is getting back to what plans could look like, outlines a number of different suggestions that we've received from 4 different interveners as to what the plans could look like. They all range from $20 to $35 a month. But when I look at what's already available in the market, there are already plans that aren't that far off the $20 to $35 mark. And I understand not far is a relative term. $5, $10 is a significant amount for many individuals. How feasible would it be for you to implement and still be able to meet your commitments if you adopted the plan of the coalition, for example? Would you realistically be able to put a plan in the market, $25 to $30, unlimited voice and texting, 4 gigs of data a month?
That would cause a significant re-rate of our existing base. The issue in that particular proposal is the 4 gigabytes of data, which has a retail and has had a retail for a number of years considerably higher than the 25 to 30. Again, if you're talking about curating this for a specific subset of the population, that's a different thing. But to have a plan like this widely available for, I think, all carriers, certainly for us, would cause a re-rate of that for people that are already paying a higher price for this, with no evident, no evident benefit to the carrier.
So from a social good standpoint, that may be doable under a program similar to the one we just discussed, connecting families for internet, but not for the wider population.
The Connecting Families program was a program that was, it effectively is a subsidy by the industry, and as a result, it is subject to eligibility requirements that are vetted through an administrative process. But in order to commit to that subsidy, that requires us to undertake significant diligence on what the quantum of that subsidy would be. And we did that through the Connecting Families process. We obviously haven't done that for the wireless side. And keep in mind where we're at in terms of our own scale and our own growth. We're at a very different place than our principal competitors. And actually, this is a segment of the market, the lower end of the market, that we are particularly effective in playing in and always have been. And we want to maintain that comparative advantage, and we want to maintain that differentiation potential. When we're talking about mandated plans on a broad basis, that potential for us is very harmful. It's not an opportunity. It's a source of harm. So connecting families is one thing, but we have to talk about what the constraints are with that, because again, it's a subsidy. A broad mandated plan is regulation, and regulation will hurt emerging competitors like Freedom.
And if I could as well, Commissioner, I think it is worth reminding everyone that the history of the development of the subscriber base of Freedom and Wind, as is typical with new entrants into the marketplace, typically starts from lower value subscribers. So we have, on a rateable basis, considerably more subscribers at $30 as a percentage of our base than the incumbents would have, which means if we were to move to adopt something like this, and the industry did it, it would have a disproportionate degree of harm to our subscriber base and profitability.
I thank you. I appreciate those additional comments, because it helps put some color around your particular reality versus others. Just a couple of final questions before I move on. If some type, not suggesting what it would look like, if some type of mandated occasional use or low-cost plan were to be implemented, would any additional requirements need to put in place to ensure proper training of staff, proper access on your websites that it be promoted in a similar manner?
Eligibility confirmation would be a new phase of training for us, a new element of training to ensure that the customer is in fact able to receive the benefit, whether it's subsidized or otherwise. That would be the primary thing.
Okay.
Otherwise, it would be a straightforward element to the addition to the training.
Okay, perfect. The CCTS has stated that if the Commission were to impose low-cost or occasional use plans, the Commission would simply need to impose certain specific requirements on a particular type of wireless plan, and the service would remain unregulated. And as a result, they would be authorized to receive customer complaints about billing and service delivery related to those plans. Would you agree with that assessment by the CCTS?
No. This would be a regulated plan. You would have to go through your forbearance analysis to determine that the market isn't sufficiently competitive to protect consumers. On the face of the record that you have today, including the page that Paul pointed to, there's no reasonable basis for you to do that. There is no reasonable basis for you to re-regulate this end of the market. So we would submit that you can't do that. And if you were to do that, it would therefore be a regulated service that would not be under the jurisdiction of the CCTS.
Okay, thank you for that. Win-backs. In response to question 204 of our RFI from July the 15th, you indicated that the national providers are targeting your customers using anti-competitive win-back tactics, specifically targeting Freedom customers. Can you expand upon that or provide any evidence to support that particular statement?
Yeah, there's a long history in this business of as quickly as possible trying to repatriate a customer once they've indicated that they're about to port. And the big three have, certainly in my time, 3 years here at Freedom, been particularly aggressive and particularly predatory in their pursuit of customers that have indicated a desire to port or in the midst of a port, going so far as to calling them while they're in our stores on their phone and offering them substantial, even better than retail offers in order to walk out of our store. So yeah, there's a pretty significant body of evidence for that.
Do you have any insight as to whether that win-back activity is specifically being directed at Freedom, or would you assume it's being directed at any customer that tries to port away from one of the big three?
I have a pretty strong sense, but I think that's a great question for the three guys coming after me.
They will be here. Can you give me any sense as to how significant an issue that is for your company?
Well, first off, thank you for asking about this. It's a significant issue for us on a number of fronts. I think it's been long perceived, and perhaps it's a dated perspective, that win-backs are sort of a victimless impact. That's anything but the case. As we move to a world in which the average selling price of a phone in our store is about $1,000 now. 3 years ago, by the way, that number was $300, but since we've taken on the iPhone and brought ourselves up into a broader device range, customers are now spending on average between $900 and $1,000 when they buy a phone from us. When we crack the cellophane on an iPhone box, and if I do nothing more than crack the cellophane on an iPhone box, it's worth about $200 to $250 less than it was 10 seconds before. That's the reality of now a used phone. So when someone comes into a store and indicates a desire to port and starts the process for us of opening a new box and moving into a new subscribership, and then gets a phone call from one of the incumbents to come back, get some ridiculous, way below kind of rack rate type offer because they typically know if they're in a Freedom store what they're buying, that predatory call costs us hundreds of dollars in cash for what is oftentimes no more than a 20 or 30 minute interaction with a customer who, by the way, is now across the hall in the mall at one of the big three stores. So we're left with a big chunk of cellophane, an empty box, and a bit of a broken heart.
Are there specific win-back tactics that you are most concerned about, or you feel that are most egregious?
The most significant one is the call upon the trigger of a port. So that really is by a long way the most significant one. They will continue to call a customer back well after the customer has left our store. It's just a little bit harder for them to be successful when the customer's already gone home. But I would say, just as a general principle, not dissimilar to what we saw in the old days of long distance in this country, I would suggest that a ban on contact with the customer for some period of time is probably something that's well worth consideration.
Okay, thank you. I honored my commitment. I did spend the first half of my questions on non-MVNOs, but the moment has arrived. You had said in your first submission on the topic of mandated MVNO access, customers may end up with more competitors but not strong competition. So I want to talk about that for a bit. You submitted that the CRTC would need to revisit our essentiality, the essentiality of wholesale roaming for MVNOs, because the last time we looked at that, we did it at the same time as wholesale roaming. Is it your view that MVNO access is essential if we were to analyze it alone?
No, it's not essential. It fails on a number of fronts. The one where it clearly fails is on the competition input. The absence of mandated MVNO does not result in a substantial lessening of competition. In fact, the presence of mandated MVNO will result in a substantial lessening of competition. Other aspects of that test, that analysis that you run under the requirements of TRP 2015-326 are not satisfied by any proponent who's argued for a mandated MVNO. The policy reasons why you didn't mandate MVNO back in 2015 are still relevant today. I would argue they're even more relevant today because, as Peter explained, competitors like Freedom need to invest on two tracks, not one. They need to expand coverage and they need to invest for 5G.
With respect to the relevant geographic market, how should we be looking at that? Is it a national market for wholesale MVNO access? Should we look at it from a provincial perspective? Should it go even more local than that?
The Competition Bureau provided a very useful, thorough, robust model for assessing the geographic market, where there is a strong facilities-based disruptor versus where there is not. And so you look at where that is the case. It could be, in the case of Saskatchewan, for example, that's on a provincial basis, or in other provinces, it's on a CMA basis, or it's smaller. One of the reasons why we talk about the Tier 4 area as a relevant area for purposes of a remedy is because that's a very clear indication of where a facilities-based disruptor is or is not. They have the license, and they've either deployed that license or they have not. That's a very good indication about whether that presence exists or it doesn't. And effectively, that is what we've learned from the Competition Bureau's analysis and work, is the geographic market is defined by the presence or absence of a facilities-based disruptor.
Just from a very practical standpoint, do you think it would be too cumbersome to mandate wholesale access on a subnational level?
For MVNO?
For the underlying service provider, or from the standpoint of the Commission?
Well, if we're talking about a facilities-focused MVNO along the lines of what we've proposed, no. There's a way that you can do that. There's a way that that the MNO can do that.
Okay. Many have suggested that it would be the regional carriers who would suffer the most if a full MVNO were mandated. To what degree would your concerns be alleviated if the mandated MVNO looked like the Bureau's model?
Well, I think you can see that between what Shaw proposed by way of minimum parameters and what the Bureau proposed, there's a lot of alignments between the two. They flow from the fundamental premise of looking at places, at those Canadians that don't have the competitive alternatives that are bringing benefits to some. Where is there a fourth disruptor, a facilities-based disruptor? Where isn't there? And so from that perspective, our focus is exactly the same. In terms of eligibility, our focus is also exactly the same. An experienced wireless provider with the credibility and capability of building a wireless network within that Tier 4 area, which we think is the right geographic area, is a key part of their proposal. It's a key part of our proposal. What we've also suggested, which is really just an additional detail beyond what the Bureau has proposed, is that to be eligible, a party would have to have a license. And that takes care of a lot of the concerns that were raised about encouraging parties to deploy within the time frame or punish a penalty of some kind if they don't. Under our additional detail, which is really just a tweak, you wouldn't need to do that, because to determine eligibility, you need to have a license. So you've made the investment in the license, you're subject to deployment requirements. The temporary MVNO allows you to deploy sooner than you otherwise would, and otherwise you're already incented because you have those deployment obligations. So, and I just reiterate one point that I interpret the Bureau proposal to say is that there is no MVNO regime in any area where there is currently a facilities-focused or facilities-based disruptor. So you only go where there is no disruptor today. So in our proposal, a Tier 4 area that has no build by a competitive alternative to the big three, that would be an eligible area.
And would that be a market that your company is interested in entering as an MVNO provider in parts of the country where there is no facilities-based competitor to one of the big three?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yes. Sorry,
Okay, it's two yeses.
We're debating
Bill.
who gets to say yes. Again, devil in the details, but yes, as a general principle, that would be correct.
Okay. And under the Bureau's proposal, we still obviously want to make sure that there is going to be facilities-based investment in the country. And one of the concerns is that you or other providers enter given regions as an MVNO, and it serves to put downward pressure on investment in those particular areas, or remove the desire of companies to invest in a given area. How might we look at alleviating some of those concerns?
as we've proposed, there should already be investment to obtain eligibility. And the key entry ticket, so to speak, is to buy a license in the relevant area. So that actually triggers a whole set of other incentives. You have deployment obligations under those spectrum licenses, and you've paid money for the spectrum licenses, so you're incented to monetize them. The MVNO is really just a temporary measure to accelerate timing to make some areas that would otherwise not be economical. And you only have the benefit of it for a very short window, 5 years. And that's why we believe the 5-year phase out is critical, because that is also an incentive to make sure that people invest and make use of that spectrum license that they have acquired and paid money for. Otherwise, at the end of the MVNO period, if they haven't deployed a network to put that spectrum to work, then they have nothing. They can't operate anymore. They have no ability to service their subscribers.
And obviously getting that spectrum is a significant hurdle. If MVNO access were granted under this, or mandated under this scenario, how much faster would an entrant such as yourself be able to enter those underserved markets relative to the time frame that would be required for you to actually go out and build the network yourself?
Fairly quickly. We know the most significant issues there, and Brian will add in on the network side. Because we've expanded things like our distribution, so in our instance, we have retailers like Loblaws and Walmart that we would be able to immediately tap into, who would have existing distribution in most of those locales. It's a natural extension for us on most operational fronts. So from that standpoint, it would be a very, very quick to market strategy for us. Brian, on the network side?
Yeah, on the other side. There we go. On the other side, from my point of view, having to build a network, it takes, especially in the smaller markets we're talking about going into, typically you don't have big skyscrapers you're putting antennas on top. You have to build towers. And that takes a couple of years to get permits to build. So it's a 3+ year window from the time we say, let's go to build a market like Fort McMurray until we can actually turn it on. So I think the point is here, we'd be able to implement service through an MVNO regime while building the market. and then swap over the customers once all the towers and sites are built.
That sounds like a very great scenario that you just outlined. What happens in the scenario whereby a provider, perhaps not as responsible as yourselves, does not undertake those network investments? Yes, they bought the spectrum, but they don't actually proceed over the 5 years to build the towers, to build that network infrastructure, and they just in turn decide to sell the spectrum at the last minute, or in the 4th year of the 5-year mandate period.
I do think it reaffirms the need for that admission process, so to speak, and as a minimum, you need to buy spectrum. You've undertaken the risk of holding that on your balance sheet and not doing anything with it. The Competition Bureau has supported other ways of verifying eligibility and credibility. We believe you should have a proven track record in the wireless market of building. You are a builder. You can demonstrate to the Commission that you're capable of that. I don't think with those constraints on admission, on eligibility, I don't think you need to worry too much about the back end. People want to build, if they're a credible wireless provider in Canada and they have a demonstrated track record like Freedom does, why would we abandon a Tier 4 area? It doesn't make any sense.
Is 5 years enough time to undertake that deployment? I mean, you had mentioned it can take 3 years in a given area, but there are challenges with building in this country. Is 5 years appropriate?
Answer it. You have to. There we go. Yes, it is. I mean, there will always be outliers. Any city I'm in today, I have sites I've been looking for 5, 6, 7 years for a given location. But the vast majority you can do within that realm. And if we're talking about going into a place, again, like a Fort McMurray, it's probably 10 sites you have to build. Maybe it's 15. It's on that order of magnitude. It's not like you're going into a Toronto and having to build 800 sites. So the 5-year window for that scale for most of these markets is very reasonable.
There is the balancing consideration of incentivizing people to build too. So this has to be a little bit shorter than a comfortable period of time. It has to actually encourage you to get started, encourage you to plan, encourage you to negotiate the MVNO terms. This is designed to accelerate sustainable competition through facilities-based competitive investment. And that 5 years makes sense. I mean, just to give some perspective, Shaw bought Freedom in 2016. It's 2020.
When does the 5-year clock start ticking?
From the date of the decision.
Not the date of whenever a provider is able to get access to the spectrum.
The one thing that the Commission has to do, and the Bureau spoke about this earlier, is determine the eligible areas. One of the reasons why we proposed a Tier 4 area is because you can easily do that through ISED data, for example. You can look at ISED data to determine whether a carrier has deployed spectrum. If any spectrum is deployed in any way, that area comes off the list. So you would have to undertake that process fairly quickly after you make this decision. I'm saying the clock should run from the date of the decision. If you wanted to give yourself the time to actually decide where eligible areas would be, that's a reasonable compromise, but it should start soon. And in terms of the parties' eligibility, anytime within the 5 years, if it's an eligible area and they become eligible, then they can choose to deploy, but the whole regime ends in 5 years. It's not contingent on each specific party's time frame for deployment.
And what happens at 5 years and 1 day, assuming some of these MVNOs have not built out their network, or at least have not built out their network to the entire area, and there would be, customers that would potentially be left stranded or without service if and when a mandate comes to an end in 5 years?
Well, I mean, one other possibility, of course, is that this is a negotiated arrangement. So if you need more time and you're one of the players who got eligibility through your vetting process, and if the eligibility area was vetted through your process, you would negotiate more time with your MNO carrier.
And if you're unable to reach an agreement?
What happens when licenses don't get renewed?
Okay. Which carriers should be obligated to provide the MVNO access? Is that limited to the big three, or are there different ways to potentially slice this?
Well, the big three have the national networks, the national coverage, the scale. The Bureau talks about market power. This obligation should be confined to the big three. It is not appropriate to put that obligation on a party that is currently building a competitive network. That doesn't make sense.
But if one of the arguments is that regional carriers could potentially be most harmed by the entry of an MVNO, if Freedom, for example, were mandated to grant MVNO access, would you at least not be able to offset some of that lost retail revenue with wholesale arrangements?
Well, if we're talking about our model or the Competition Bureau's model, by definition, we wouldn't be there, so we wouldn't be providing service. So it's physically impossible for us to do that.
But other models?
On a broad MVNO resale mandate, would the wholesale revenue from a broad MVNO resale mandate offset the harm to our business if you mandated broad MVNO resale?
Help offset, yes.
Help offset? I think the evidence is overwhelming that MVNOs are going to target our subs, target our segments of the market. They're not going to compete against the MNOs. So the answer is an unqualified no, it will not. And on the same token, we're not really in a position at our point of scale or network deployment to be providers of wholesale services that
would be attractive.
That would be attractive.
Okay. What about a company like SaskTel that has a very large market share in Saskatchewan and a very robust network? Would you see that obligation extending to them to provide MVNO access?
Well, in the broad MVNO mandate, it's not a model that we support. It's not a model that we think you can or should implement. In our proposal, in the case of SaskTel, if they are operating in that area, then it's not eligible for MVNO.
Okay. Moving on to limitations, should MVNOs be permitted to wholesale access to other MVNOs?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that, again, it depends on the framework that you're talking about. We've spent a lot of time thinking about a different version of MVNO. And in that framework, where the MVNO arrangement is negotiated, it's a negotiated arrangement. So that's up to the parties to determine. In a broad MVNO resale mandate, of course, we would object to a resale of resale, just like for the same reasons why we object to resale. It doesn't satisfy your test. It's going to harm freedom. It's going to harm competition. It's going to harm Canada. So no resale of resale if it's a broad mandate.
Thank you for that clarification. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Would one of the challenges with reselling the service of an MVNO be that the underlying network operator wouldn't have any visibility into who the end user actually is and problems that could create. We've had similar complaints on the wireline side. And I believe it was Eastlink raised that concern in this proceeding as well, that the more times the service of an MVNO is resold, the underlying network provider has no visibility into the end user.
That might be a concern, which is probably, again, if it's a commercial arrangement, then you probably have some obligations to disclose that information or have appropriate visibility into that information. But, I mean, in a broad MVNO resale mandate, yes, that would be a concern. It would also be a concern for any eligibility constraints that you put on this if there's no visibility into end users or subsequent resellers who have that opportunity.
Okay, thanks. What about particular lines of business? Would you have any concerns with an MVNO under your proposal selling to enterprise clients, selling M2M or IoT services?
Under our proposal, this would be a negotiation.
And your answer would be the opposite under a broader.
Yes, I mean, again, you'd have to really, when we're talking about the broad MVNO, we struggle with that because in order to get to that broad MVNO mandate, we would have to go through the requirements of 2015-326 essentiality. In our view, it fails on a number of fronts. So, and that's in the context of retail consumer services, and that in that regard, it fails. It most definitely fails in the highly dynamic, unexplored area of M2M and other business markets.
And under your proposal, would access to 5G networks be included or not?
It would be negotiated.
Okay, thank you. I get the sense that may be a response to a number of questions that I had. I probably have about another 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I don't know if you wanted to.
Why don't we recess for 15 minutes, and we'll resume just after 1:45, and then you can complete your questions, and I think members may have a few others. Thank you. Commissioner McDonald.
Welcome back. So with respect to your proposal and it being commercially negotiated, obviously the rates would be commercially negotiated. Would that apply to the terms and conditions as well?
Yes. As we've said on the record, MVNO is not a static thing. It's a unique thing tailored to the circumstances. So terms and conditions would be negotiated.
I would assume that adds a certain level of complexity to any negotiation. Does it, if the terms and conditions are to be negotiated, does that make it more likely that an agreement would not be reached?
No, not at all. Globally, this is typically how they're managed and are subject to dynamic living agreements. So we needn't look any farther than the U.S. to see pretty significant MVNO activity that's had decades-long expansion, all done under commercial negotiation.
Thank you. In an ideal world, every negotiation would be successfully concluded and everyone is happy. What happens when that is not the case?
So one of the things that we'd encourage the Commission to do in this context is set timelines for the negotiation. that has to be reasonable. And as Paul said, this will be a commercial negotiation. If you can't get an agreement within a timeline, then there would be an arbitration mechanism to resolve the dispute. We've pointed to the ISED arbitration rules as a possible basis for dispute resolution. We'd want to encourage as much as possible to get to a negotiated outcome.
What's reasonable? What's a reasonable amount of time before one party could say, no, this negotiation isn't going to go anywhere. I need a backstop from the Commission, for example.
Under the roaming rules and even the site sharing rules that I said, there are timeframes for requesting parties to make proposals and for receiving parties to make kind of counter proposals and back. You could adopt that, and if those timelines are not met, there could be some mechanism for trying to resolve that part of the process. But overall, this is a commercial negotiation on this. For something like this, which will also require the facilities-based disruptor to figure out how and when they're going to build. And that's a key ingredient behind this whole thing. Like that's the end goal here, is we want someone to build. So they need to figure out when and where they're going to build and how they're going to build, and they're going to be concurrently negotiating this MVNO. So 6 to 9 months is probably a reasonable time frame to get a deal done.
Okay. And if a deal doesn't get done and the parties end up in a final offer arbitration before us, do you think that process will be much more cumbersome if we're trying to also deal with terms and conditions versus solely dealing with rates, as an example?
Well, terms and conditions and rates are all part of a bucket of things that are trade-offs in a commercial negotiation. So it's hard for us sitting here. It's hard for the Commission to determine exactly what that looks like from this vantage point without giving the parties, the MNO and the MVNO, or the facilities-based disruptor, the opportunity to figure that out.
But at a minimum, it would introduce more moving parts.
It would, yes. It would introduce more moving parts.
Okay. Then, in an effort to try and nail down some of those moving parts in advance, would it make more sense for the Commission to outline what standard T's and C's would actually look like to form the basis for these commercial negotiations?
You just want to avoid the risk of constraining it to be unfavorable to the facilities-based disruptor. You'd want to you don't want to prejudge the negotiation. That's the downside of the certainty that you're trying to bring there. We're trying to encourage a model that's focused as much as possible on market forces and a negotiated outcome. And I think you've got to let that process run its course before you define, without the benefit of that commercial discussion, that commercial arrangement, define what this thing will look like in this particular region for these particular carriers. That there's risk in that.
So can some of that risk be mitigated if whatever we put forward was the basis, or at a most basic level, what the T's and C's would include and look like, and then the parties are free to negotiate better terms if they can come to an agreement?
Sure, you can set a baseline. I don't know how you define exactly what that is.
Okay. Do you envision that final offer arbitration being done by the Commission, or do you see that being done by a third party?
I think you'd want a third party involved with expertise in networks, with expertise in commercial arrangements.
If it wasn't a third party and it was the Commission, do our existing FOA processes, would they be appropriate in this context?
Well, I believe they are limited to rates. I think you need a broader mandate than that, and that's one of the reasons why we suggested looking at the ISED rules, because they wouldn't have the constraints of just looking at rates in a final offer arbitration process.
Okay. Now let's assume we don't take your suggestions with respect to what the model could look like, and potential rates are not left to commercial negotiation. How would you see that rate setting taking place? Some have suggested a retail minus approach.
If you're asking whether we're supportive of that, we're not. Rate setting is a very complicated process, and we're really encouraging you to focus on a negotiated outcome. The rate setting process on wholesale roaming rates is imperfect. It's clearly not in line with what's happening in the retail market, where prices are coming down significantly. And that was just finalized in 2018 after years and years and years. So from a practical perspective, if we're trying to get a remedy out there that's going to have an accelerated impact from a timing perspective, I think a rate setting exercise is not a fruitful way to go. I think the negotiated outcome is the way to go.
Do you care to comment specifically on the retail minus approach?
No.
Okay. If we did go down the route of rate setting, would the use of the existing wholesale roaming rates be an appropriate interim rate to set?
For a mandated MVNO that's constrained in the way that we have proposed, sure.
Okay.
Is there a problem with the mandated the mandated roaming rates? Yes.
Thank you. Some parties have expressed some concerns about the potential entry of large, well-capitalized firms, large tech firms from the U.S. potentially coming in and taking advantage of a mandated MVNO access structure that may be advantageous to them but may not be in the long term advantageous to Canadians or the networks upon which we rely. Can you expand on your thoughts in that regard?
We share their view, and much as the Competition Bureau indicated earlier today, believe that requiring wireless operators to have some skin in the game, the way that we've articulated in our proposal, is the right way to go.
This issue is an example of the perils of this mandated MVNO regime. There is no barrier for parties that have undertaken the risks of investment to build new networks. They have overcome barriers, in part because of spectrum policy, in part because of a mandated roaming regime, but also mostly, almost 100%, because of significant investment of billions of dollars. Whether we're talking about a reseller in Canada who has scale, and there are several, or we're talking about a foreign player who has even bigger scale, there is a risk to letting someone come in and get regulated access to a network and get an advantage over what Freedom has in terms of network quality. There is a huge risk. Ease of entry, ease of exit. They don't have to make a commitment. They don't have to build anything. They don't have to undertake any risk. That puts us in a competitive disadvantage a significant competitive disadvantage. It's amplified if you're talking about very large multinationals, but it's no different in kind from the risk that we're going to be facing from resellers with scale in Canada. We can't overstate the concern we have with that. We've said on the record, if there is a broad MVNO mandate, which we obviously significantly object to, there has to be some kind of restriction from multinationals. There has to be a restriction that they are Canadian-owned and controlled to mitigate that risk. But it still doesn't take away from the risk of a reseller in Canada getting a significant competitive advantage over us and undermining the value of the investments that we've made.
If I could as well.
Sorry.
If I could as well, these are not organizations that just fell off the back of a truck. They've had ample opportunity to participate in spectrum transactions, to participate in spectrum auctions, and to be builders the way that ourselves and others have been in this country. I think it is a dangerous precedent to reward the shortcut that you're suggesting, to allow them to piggyback and ride our rails after years of investment. They've had their opportunity to be at the dance and have chosen not to take it.
I apologize if I misspoke because I wasn't suggesting such a model. I was actually trying to make sure that such a model doesn't happen.
Knew I liked you.
So I mean, the concern would be Amazon, for example. Amazon Prime, they include their streaming service free of charge for $100 a year in an effort to sell everyone everything. Wireless could just be a throwaway item that ends up getting absorbed into the larger company without network investment, with investments in the Canadian economy. So to prevent such a scenario, is a market cap feasible?
Videotron has suggested a market cap again as another constraint, but these constraints aren't getting to the root of the problem. And of course, we support Videotron's market cap constraint. We support the constraint of Canadian ownership requirement. It doesn't get to the root of the problem. You are mandating access for a player that will not make an investment, that will not innovate the way that we have, and will not disrupt the big three the way that we have. That is the fundamental issue. So the constraints, we can talk about them. Obviously, we support constraints on the broad mandated MVNO regime. It doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is empowering a competitor that has made no investment, that has not undertaken any risk, and has no proven record of delivering benefits to Canadians that we have. That's what's at risk in this proceeding.
Thank you for that. On the topic of your proposed model, what's the most feasible way to impose an investment threshold, and how should the Commission monitor over the 5 years before the sunset to ensure that those investment commitments and objectives are being met year over year?
The Shaw minimum parameters were designed so that you actually don't have to be a police force on deployment. You have to make sure that the admission criteria are strictly enforced. So as the Competition Bureau has said, someone with a proven track record in wireless, eligibility should be limited to someone with a proven track record. We agree with that. As a minimum, you have to have a license in the area. If you have a license in the area, the license will be subject to deployment requirements. You have to build out that license. It takes you to the same conversation we were having a little while ago about, there will be a natural incentive for you to build out before the mandated MVNO regime, the temporary one for 5 years, expires.
Well, there's a natural incentive to build out unless the strategy of a given firm is to hold on to the spectrum for 5 years and then sell it for a much higher rate than they originally paid for it.
But there are deployment requirements under these spectrum licenses.
And you don't think any monitoring from the Commission would be required.
I wouldn't discourage you from monitoring. What we were trying to do was design an administratively efficient model where you wouldn't have to kind of police the deployment, because the deployment should take place on as much as possible, a market-based mechanism. And that would avoid the need to have some kind of penalty or amps or other sort of enforcement mechanisms at the end, because there are a bunch of incentives in place for the carrier to deploy.
Thank you. I should have given the chair a heads up. Those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner McDonald. I have, like many things in life, your answers to questions beget other questions. So I do have a couple to add, and other members may as well. In response to one of Commissioner McDonald's questions earlier, I think it was Mr. English, you described in responding to a question about the cost of spectrum, a global average cost of spectrum. Just wondering how that was calculated, where it came from, and whether...
Sure, and I was talking about specifically the 600 megahertz spectrum auction that concluded last year, and we paid about 78 cents, and we went and looked at, other, and that's on a per megahertz per pop basis, when we went and looked at other global spectrum auctions that have occurred within that same band around the world. It was right on top of the global average. And
so that's something that you assembled in looking at public data? In other jurisdictions?
Ourselves and our consultants that were helping us through the spectrum auction, that's correct.
And would you be able to file that with us?
Yes. In confidence,
yes.
Yes.
That's fine.
Yes.
If you accept that as an undertaking, and council at the end of the proceeding will remind everybody what the deadlines are. I don't have it in front of me, but that's fine. I also wanted to go back to seamless roaming for a second. If you are able to operate as an MVNO in areas where you have spectrum but haven't fully deployed, does that mitigate or eliminate the concerns you have about seamless roaming?
No, it doesn't, because the real issue is at the edge of areas where we are already. As you move from where our customers are today, such as in the Ottawa area, 100% of the calls drop as you cross that border. And that's what we're trying to overcome.
Okay. And I guess I'll ask my next question and I'll come back to it. One of the things I'm struggling with a little bit is data, some hard numbers about some of these issues. You mentioned it in the context of win-backs. You mentioned it in terms of seamless roaming and delays in access to support structures. I don't mean to belittle the concern, but when it's anecdotal and it's a significant problem, I'm trying to understand what is significant, and if, to the extent that you can help us with that by giving us hard data on some of these issues, it would be useful. So, for example, you indicated you tracked some of the reasons for customer churn, and that network issue on drop calls were a major issue in that regard. Do you have data that you could share with us to support that assertion? I don't expect you to be able to
We do
have that offhand, but if you could provide that through an undertaking,
we'd be happy to.
that would be very helpful. If you could do the breakdown, for example, for the reasons provided by your subscribers, leaving in, let's say, over the last couple of years, 2018, 2019?
Certainly.
Thank you. Similarly, with win-back, do you track the amount of prospective customers appearing in your retail points of presence that are subject to those kinds of win-back offers?
We do. Although, to be clear, Mr. Chairman, it's not always obvious after the point of sale what their reason for return is, but we have a good sense, certainly when it happens in our stores.
Understood. You're not going to be surprised when I say, will you agree to an undertaking in a minute, but maybe I can ask another couple of points, and then we can describe the undertaking. Today, you suggested a time-limited prohibition as a possible approach to address the issue of contacting a departing customer. What kind of time frame are you suggesting?
I think something in the order of 90 to 180 days is more than suitable. Most of the damage is done within 30. So if you can imagine your own experience, you have your sensitivity to a call 6 months after the fact is not nearly as great as it is while you're standing in the store, and the offer may be more appealing. So it doesn't need to be a long prohibition. I'd be comfortable with 90 days sort of solving most of the issue.
So as a general sense in terms of win-back campaigns, but you mentioned that I thought I understood your key problem being people being contacted even as they're making the transaction. So you think across the board, once they've engaged with you, there would be a restriction for periods such as 90 days?
I think the best single point would be the trigger of a port. So that is when the donor carrier is notified, and that's when their machine goes into overdrive. So it's from that moment, and then if we had 90 days after that, I think as an industry we would see we'd see a lot more calm.
Then would you accept an undertaking, and I think part of this may be in confidence and part of it would be for the public record, would you accept an undertaking to give us some more detail with respect to the numbers of prospective customers or customers appearing in your retail points of presence that are subject to win-back offers?
Absolutely.
I'm guessing that one might be in confidence.
It would be.
And then secondarily, could you give us some further or put your proposal for a win-back restriction into a document?
We'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last question, but before I go there, I think I'll ask my colleagues if they have any questions.
On that issue of the seamless roaming, you indicated that when you attempted to conduct negotiations with Rogers Bell that it was just a non-starter. So I'm more interested in finding out a non-starter in terms of just they're saying they're not interested, or what are the reasons given why it was not feasible to have a seamless roaming arrangement? You think it's because the Commission didn't mandate it in 2015?
It's not mandated. It's very difficult to get any oxygen into the room on these conversations. The price, as I said, is already established by the mandated roaming. It's simply a matter of catching attention. There's no engagement there at all.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Barron?
Thank you. This morning, the chair had a brief discussion with the Competition Bureau on profitability and the link between profitability and retail price. I'm wondering, with regards to your own investment plans, to what extent they are sensitive or dependent on your current level of profitability?
Yeah, it's very sensitive right now. You know, when we started this journey in 2016, we knew we had significant upfront capital and investments required to scale the business, and we're happy with the way, you know, our subscriber loading and everything else is going. You know, roughly 200 to 250,000 subscribers a year that we're adding. However, that being said, our margin is roughly 20%. You know, we're still spending. You know, last year we generated $200 million of EBITDA. We still spent almost $385 million of capital, and that doesn't, you know, that's a loss of, you know, $185 million, and that doesn't attribute any associated financing costs to our original investment. So, you know, the profitability of our operations are very significant in terms of how we think about future investment, and they're very sensitive to subscriber loading, and it's very sensitive to the amount of revenue that we can receive from our customers on a recurring basis.
Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Two last ones instead of one. One short. On the similar theme as I pursued a minute ago. Again, with respect to access delays, with respect to access to support structures, do you have data that you would be able to share with us?
We've got data in terms of informed from our wireline experience and our Wi-Fi attachment experience. We could produce that in connection with the, in an undertaking in connection with, and it's analogous, the Wi-Fi data is analogous with the small cells in that it's a piece of equipment on the strand between the poles, if that's of help for the Commission.
It might be. So why don't we, if you'll undertake to provide that, then we can certainly look at it and add it to the record. A healthy record is desirable. So my last question.
Maybe, Mr. Chair, excuse me. Perhaps also if we look at our just the delays generally that we face, that might be helpful or informative in terms of access to the ILEC infrastructure.
That's fine. Hopefully with some not anecdotal and not general, but specifics would be helpful.
We understand. Yep.
Thank you. So my last question is, it relates to, well, call it your proposal, the Bureau's proposal, and a full MVNO all rolled into one. If it's a good thing, to provide disruptors, as you call them, this could be the theme of a new global series, I think, reality TV. If it's a good thing for disruptors to have access to, through an MVNO, throughout the territory where they have spectrum, would it be a better thing for them to have access outside their areas where they hold spectrum?
Absolutely not. The point of this hearing is to encourage sustainable competition, innovation, lower prices, and the expansion of network, high-quality wireless networks for all Canadians. So if there's MVNO outside of licensed territories, what's the incentive to, how do you reconcile that with a model that's intended to promote sustainable competition?
The underlying premise there, and I accept it, is that you want to continue to provide the facilities-based entrant with an incentive to build out facilities. Presumably, any such model would have to be accompanied by such an incentive, something that would continue to incentivize their build-out. But would it not generate more revenue, perhaps enable a faster build-out of for the facilities-based carrier within their spectrum, their territory where they have spectrum?
So are you? So who else is eligible in that scenario?
Those who hold spectrum, as you call them, disruptors.
I mean, I think the fundamental premise that the Bureau took us to this morning is really informative. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And the problem seems to be that where we don't have a facilities-based disruptor, there's less competition. And that is why we should be encouraging competition and investment in those areas where there is no facilities-based disruptor.
And what about the areas where there aren't a facilities-based disruptor? Outside of the major municipalities, in a number of rural, underserved areas?
Well, that's exactly what our proposal is designed to incent investment there, where a carrier can get access to spectrum, whether it's a relatively larger carrier like Freedom or a small local wireless provider that provides local wireline service. There are several in Canada. They could take advantage of this model. They could obtain, or they may already have, spectrum in the relevant Tier 4 area. They can get a temporary MVNO to accelerate, their build, to make it economical where it wasn't previously economical. That's an expansion of network infrastructure, which is good for the economy, good for competition, good for all of the objectives that you have in this proceeding. If you don't have that requirement, then how is that different from a broad resale MVNO?
Okay, thank you. Any last questions? Then thank you very much for your presentation and your responses. Been very helpful.
Mr. Chair? Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, we have a few questions we'd like to ask.
I omitted to ask counsel. You're not excused. And I've been a bad chair. I forgot to ask legal counsel if they have questions, and I know they do. Please go ahead.
I just have two or three quick questions, and I know my colleague has a question. You undertook to put some flesh around your win-back prohibition suggestion, and this might be discussed in whatever document you provide, but just in case it isn't, are you suggesting that such a prohibition would apply to your company as well?
Equally to all carriers.
Equally to all carriers. When you were speaking about the approach to a mandated MVNO service, should one be put into place, and you spoke about a negotiated, essentially a negotiation regime that was backstopped by arbitration, but you were talking specifically about a third-party arbitrator. And I was trying to understand, and perhaps you can clarify this matter for us a little bit, how that proposal meshes with legal rules against delegation of statutory powers. So if the matters under dispute go to a third-party arbitrator, it's the arbitrator that determines the binding terms, conditions, and rates for a service that would be mandated by the Commission?
So the reason for, again, we were inspired, I suppose, by the arbitration guidelines of ISID in its regulatory framework for roaming. We have not considered the precise question you've raised about delegation of authority. It took place in the ISID context, and we can assess whether it could take place in the CRTC context and undertake to respond to that.
That would be appreciated. And also, related to that is the question how that process would result in a just and reasonable rate, especially if, under a more traditional final offer arbitration process, essentially the way the mechanism is conceived to work is people are coming to the Commission with essentially the parameters of the service understood, and then the competing parties to the arbitration put forward, the rate that they think is appropriate, knowing that if they propose a rate that is clearly unreasonable, then they might get stuck with the rate proposed by the other party, and that creates an incentive for people to provide a reasonable rate. If terms and conditions, if people are going before an arbitration body and the terms and conditions aren't even agreed upon, how do you make sure that the rate that results from the outcome is just and reasonable?
Well, I mean, this, again, in terms of the ISID guidelines, which is the guidelines we recommend starting with, there's an opportunity to influence the arbitration process, the panel of arbitrators that are involved. They would have to be experts in this field, and getting to a reasonable rate would be part of assessing the terms and conditions. What exactly is the content of this service, and what is that rate? Parties would be disciplined, just like they are in the CRTC's FOA process, to be reasonable in their submissions to the arbitrator, recognizing that the arbitrator's decision is binding. I mean, we can explore this question further in our undertaking. I'd like the opportunity to do that, but that's my immediate reaction to your question.
Thank you. I have one last question. It has to do with, I guess, lower cost plans. Would it be possible for you to provide the percentage of your customers that subscribe to a plan that has a monthly rate or a monthly equivalent rate of below $35?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Last one, I promise. Staying on the topic of low-cost plans, it's pretty clear that your view is that the marketplace is well served when it comes to low-cost occasional use plans, that there's competition there, and that as a result, it wouldn't be appropriate to deforbear from any currently foreborn powers under the Act on the basis that the market, in your view, is competitive. But the record does contain a lot of evidence from Canadians and consumer groups relating specifically to consumers in vulnerable situations who may feel that they don't have sufficient access to these plans. To follow that through, it seems like it could be possible, irrespective of the state of competition, that there is a subset of users whose interests are not being met. Could you comment on the appropriateness of potentially deforbearing on that basis as opposed to a more traditional competition analysis? I would have you consider as well the Local Forbearance Framework 2006-15, where the Commission required that standalone primary exchange service be offered under a price ceiling, even in otherwise foreborn areas, on a similar basis, on the basis that it would protect vulnerable consumers. Is that something that could be appropriate here?
No.
Okay, that is equally as clear as your previous response, so thank you.
I think we would be willing in an undertaking to provide our reasons why, if that was sort of, if that was your aspiration in asking the question. I don't know, but the answer is no.
It's up to you as to whether you'd like to comment further than that, but I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity to do so.
I think we would. Thank you.
No problem. And then finally, last question on this. Would it be appropriate, rather than mandating a plan for the Commission to potentially impose a condition of service under Section 24 relating to making sure that these plans are clearly offered and communicated to customers? I'm thinking of similar rules that exist under the wireless code, things like ensuring that customer service reps are properly trained, that prominent links are provided on websites, that information is displayed at points of sale, that sort of thing. Is that something that you would think might be appropriate?
No.
Okay. Again,
we really have that well covered today. These, as I said indicated earlier, these are plans that are well merchandised, well trained. It's unnecessary.
Okay, thank you.
Then I'll try again. And thank you for your submissions and your responses, and wish you a good day.